Howdy, my name's Cowboy Mike Grauer. I'm the Curator of Art and Western Heritage at Panhandle-Plains Historical Museum in Canyon, Texas. And we're standing outside one of the most important historic buildings in the Panhandle-Plains region. It's the cabin that eventually becomes the headquarters for the T-Anchor Ranch, one of the 5 biggest ranches that ever existed out here in the Texas Panhandle. What you're looking at is the front, which actually originally faced west. And it's constructed from logs that were cut out of the upper reaches of the Paladura Canyon, about 12 miles east of here. And though most of the logs came from cedar trees and also pine trees when Paladura was full of that kind of tree, much like we still see in Colorado and New Mexico today. Most of those trees are gone, used for building materials like you see here in the T-Anchor cabin. But they were tall and straight. And so when the 2 brothers-in-law of Charles Goodnight, Walter and Lee Dyer, constructed the cabin in 1877. They had brought a herd of about 300 cattle up from around Sherman, Texas, up this direction, along with another man named Samuel Coleman. And so while Coleman was taking care of the cows, the Dyer brothers were building the cabin. And generally, we like to think it took about 2 days to cut and shape a log. So you can, take your own deductions there on how long it took to build. It's built in a pretty typical southern house style called a dog trot cabin, or a dog run cabin with a breezeway in the middle. And it was built in 1877, thus making it probably one of the oldest existing ranch buildings in Texas, and one of the oldest existing ranch buildings in all the United States and possibly even North America. And the reason that it's important is not only for the history of the T-Anchor Ranch, but also what it represents in terms of Texas cattle, Texas cowboys, and Texas horses spreading the ranching industry from Texas and Mexico all the way north up into Western Canada. And we originally saw cabins like this built by these Texas cowboys who were not carpenters. It's important to remember that they were cowboys. All the way up into Western Canada. Unfortunately, most of those cabins are gone now, but we're very fortunate that the T-Anchor still exists. So as I said, it's built in a dog run or a dog trot style. Originally, it had no glass in the windows. All the finished lumber came from Trinidad, Colorado, which is about 360 miles northwest of here. Any other lumber came from Dodge City, but most of the materials was found locally. And it's important to remember that this is an area almost completely devoid of trees. In 1877, we're on the southern end of the Great Plains, and it was a giant treeless plain. And so therefore there were very few trees that were out here other than cottonwoods, which don't really make good building material, except for what was in Paladura Canyon. So I'm going to walk you inside. We're going to talk about some of the interior rooms, but before we go, I'll point out that it's a story and a half. The ground level rooms were used for storage, and at one time one end becomes the headquarters office for the T-Anchor Ranch. When the manager comes on board in the 1880s, it was used, one end of the bottom floor was used as an office and a bedroom. And originally you slept upstairs in the half story and you entered through a ladder and a trap door. We don't have that in our current preservation situation here, but we'll take you into the other rooms and eventually into the Chow Hall and even the Blacksmith Shop. So come on along. We're standing now in what's the north end of the cabin, originally the south end of the cabin. And as you can see, the walls are whitewashed. Finished lumber forming the ceiling above us, and also some of the original pine and cedar trees here creating the ceiling joists. As I said before, there was no glass in the windows. They were wood. We had wooden shutters on it, and the floor was packed dirt. And Walter Dyer, who was only about 15 at the time, said that was good enough for anybody. And so we do know that packed dirt was the standard floor covering back in those days. And generally, you finished off a packed dirt floor with a mixture of linseed oil and ox blood or cow blood. And we're working on restoring it to the way it originally looked. We'll look at another room here in a minute that we're working on. But in any case, this is the room that's open to the public whenever the museum is open. And we like people to come in and see the interior and learn a couple of things, one of which is the importance of this building to the U.S. historically is best evidenced by the examples here of the measured drawings done by the Historical American Buildings Survey. Used a team out of Texas Tech University to the south. And as I said, these are reproductions of their finished and measured drawings. And the Historical American Building Survey goes all over the United States, documenting specific buildings for preservation, at least on paper. And so it speaks very, very highly to the importance of the T-Anchor buildings. In any case, the whitewash on here also gives us a clue that most people, when they came out here, and in most pioneer situations, they didn't leave the walls uncovered as raw logs because they wanted to cover up the fact that they're actually living in a house made of trees. And so there were all kinds of attempts to cover it up. Whitewash, as you can see here, is very common back in the day. So, you know those Hollywood movies where the interiors of the cabins are all revealed. I mean, that speaks to this whole idea that you want to live rustic and all that stuff. Well, most people didn't want to realize they were living in primitive houses, and so whitewash was a pretty standard thing to do. It was a fairly inexpensive wall paint that you could use, and it was easy to get down here by wagon from Dodge City or from Trinidad. And those were the two main supply depots for the T-Anchor up until it starts being parceled off in the early 1900s. So we're going to take you into another room that we're starting to refurnish is the way it would have looked in 1877, 1880. So if you'll follow me, come ahead on. Now we're in the south room, actually the north room of the T-Anchor cabin on the ground floor. And you can see that it's finished a little differently from the whitewashed room. You can see newspapers or the remnants of newspapers on the wall, and this is a fairly typical wall treatment in those days. And we like to say when we give tours of the building that it's not just the wallpaper, but it also functions as the home entertainment center. Most people don't realize that in the wintertime, cowboy work really kind of shuts down, and you have a relatively small crew on the T-Anchor. T-Anchor at one time had about 50 cowboys roaming a range that was almost 1 million acres, and so it was enormous, and it took a lot of men to run those cows and make sure the cows and horses were doing okay. But in the wintertime, the crews were cut back quite a little bit, and so they were literally cooped up, hence the phrase cabin fever. And so when you put wallpaper on the walls made of newspaper, it gives you something to read. And reading was a primary activity for cowboys out here, but the problem was most cowboys were illiterate. So it was left to those cowboys who had some schooling to read the newspapers off the walls, any letters that came from home. Occasionally a saddle catalog would come in the mail. And remember, mail is infrequent. You know, every few months you might get a letter, and those letters were read so much over and over again because these cowboys were usually pretty homesick. They were usually young men, anywhere from 15 to 25 years old. They missed their mamas, they missed their baby sisters, they missed their aunts and so on. And so to hear about news from home was a primary form of entertainment, especially at night because it gets dark pretty soon. And this was, of course, pre-daylight savings time, so it got dark when it got dark. And the only thing you had to really fight most of the time out here in the wintertime was boredom. So reading was a primary activity. That's why we like to call it the home entertainment center. If you look around the room, you'll also see some furnishings in here, a cast iron stove with a stovepipe leading up into the sleeping area upstairs and also out through the roof. The problem was a cast iron stove usually implies that you're going to burn wood, but there aren't any trees out here to speak of, and so we had to burn what we call prairie coal or cow or buffalo chips, which were out here by the millions. And after a while, you have to go farther and farther out to always pick up as many buffalo or cow chips that will make a nice fire. Now, a buffalo chip fire burns hot, it burns efficiently, it doesn't stink, but we like to say that you soon learn to be somewhat discriminating about which ones you pick up, because you never want to pick up the wet ones, because they don't burn very well and they also get the mess all over you. I'm sitting in a chair and a desk to represent the office. Eventually this room will be fully appointed with a bed and probably a safe for the ranch papers, which is the way it would have looked roughly about 1885. You'll notice there is no lighting in here except for the kerosene lantern, and I like to think that they generally went to bed pretty soon after they couldn't see anymore because there wasn't anything else to do, and the kerosene was precious, so they only used as much as they could. The dirt floor in here is not quite finished the way we like to. We haven't put in the final stage of mixing with linseed oil and ox blood, as I mentioned before. But after that's done, it'll pack to the consistency of finished concrete. And they weren't left like this. They were usually covered with rugs or blankets or some other form, so you wouldn't have to stand on the hard dirt floor. But they were easily swept. And this being a dusty part of the country, dust is something we fight all the time. Now we're going to go in the back part of the cabin, which is added on about 1880, and talk about the crew of cowboys that was here and what kind of food did cowboys eat. So y'all join me. We're now inside the kitchen and chow hall that was added on to the original T-Anchor cabin, we believe about 1880. As the ranch got bigger, we needed more hands, and so as I said before, eventually we have about 50 cowboys. And so the chow hall and kitchen was put on to accommodate those cowboys who generally had been eating off the back of chuck wagons and still did, because to feed 50 men in this room would mean they have to eat in shifts, which they did. But for the most part of the crew, or the majority of the crew, was out on the range far from headquarters, and so they're still eating cowboy chuck off the back of a wagon. And basically the food stays the same regardless of whether you're out on the range or in here at headquarters. And we've set up the kitchen the way it would have looked about 1880 or so. You'll notice a cast iron step stove over there, which has 6 burners on it and a side oven. Obviously also fired up with buffalo or cow chips, and as I said, it burns efficiently and quite hot. Out the window there, which this window at one time was a door and then it was moved, so parts of it have been changed around. Outside there would have been an open fire, chuck wagon style, cooking meat of some kind, beef, and also wild game. This is one of the few times that cowboys carried guns on these ranches, is when one cowboy or two might be assigned to be a meat hunter to provide game for the table, because even cowboys got sick of eating beef after a while. And so there were buffalo out here, there were deer, antelope, turkeys, and so on. So there was some variety in the fare that they had. We like to say that cowboys rarely had a dinner salad with the things that they ate. The only kind of vegetables they really ate, for the most part, was pinto beans, frijoles, and they ate a lot of those. And that's not a cliche. They ate a lot of those simply because the managers and the owners of the ranches found that these kind of beans were very inexpensive but very filling, and so this is why cowboys ate so many beans all the time. Any fruits a cowboy had usually was either dried or came in a can, or what the cowboys called airtights, and we've got a couple of examples up here in our cabinet of canned peaches and canned tomatoes. And cowboys loved canned fruit, especially peaches and tomatoes, because it was the few times they ever got any sugar. Now, there was usually a molasses jug on the back of a chuck wagon, but in headquarters you did have molasses to mix with things, but airtights were something that cowboys craved. And the old thing about a cowboy getting his wages and going straight to the saloon, there's probably as much of them going straight to the general store and buying canned peaches and eating so many they got sick as there are those going in and wanting a shot of whiskey. So remember, these are kids for the most part. And so they all had a sweet tooth. We like to tell the school kids that cowboys didn't wake up in the morning and eat Fruit Loops for breakfast, because they didn't have anything like that. And so that's pretty much a cowboy's fare in terms of fruits and vegetables and the meats that they ate. Any drinks they had were usually either coffee or tea or water, and they came in two temperatures, hot and warm. You didn't have any way to keep anything cold. Therefore, you didn't have any milk for your Fruit Loops when you were eating out here. Didn't have any ice, didn't have any ice cream, and so it was a pretty tough list of fare for a cowboy. And the food wasn't great. It was filling, it was nutritious only up to a certain level, and cowboys tended to be on the lean side because the work was so hard and the food really wasn't very good. So you rarely found a big cowboy. Most of them weren't very tall, generally about 5'5" or 5'7". A big cowboy didn't last out here generally because the horses were small. They rode cow ponies because quarter horses come later in the 20th century. And so this is set up as you would have seen it back in the day with benches, and this is how cowboys even today eat at some of the big ranches downstate, like the Sixes and the Pitchforks and Matadors and so on. They still eat off benches just like this. So this is set up pretty much how the way it would have looked. Cowboys coming in, eating shifts, and then going back out and doing whatever they do. So I'm going to take you into the Blacksmith Shop, which is also an historic building for the T anchors, and give you another story, this time about the cowboy strike of 1883. We're now standing in the Blacksmith Shop, which was one of the original buildings at the T anchor headquarters, probably built in the early 1880s, and it's pretty typical of these type buildings and these historic ranches. All of them had a shop like this, which was partially storage and mainly a working shop for fixing things, because unlike today, when we break something, we just run down to the local convenience store or to Walmart or someplace like that and buy a new one. When you're this far away from towns, and the closest towns are Dodge and Trinidad, about 260 miles either direction, that's a long way to get someplace, because an average wagon going for supplies empty might make 15 miles a day, and then they average about 10 miles a day coming back. So that's about a 2-month round trip to fix something that's broken. And so that's what they learned to do out here, is if they couldn't fix something, they just made do. And that's why there's scraps of all kinds of things laying out here. There's pieces of leather, broken horseshoes, things to use for other things. And this is not only typical of the ranches out here, but it's also the only structure that relates directly to the cowboy strike of 1883. A group of cowboys up near the old cow town of Tascosa decided to go on strike because they wanted higher wages than what they were receiving. The standard cowboy wage in the U.S. between 1880 and 1930 was $1 a day, so that's $30 a month. When the Cowboys struck in '83, they asked for $50 a month, and they wanted the wagon bosses to go from 50 to 75. Now, when the Cowboys struck, this is important to remember, is most cowboys didn't own their own horses. They might own their own rig, meaning their saddle and the clothing that they had, but when they went on strike, the ranches simply took their horses away. And in those days, putting a cowboy on foot was just the worst thing you could possibly do. Not only was it humiliating, but it put you in shoes that would really hurt your feet. These boots that cowboys wore back in the day were not made for walking, so they put them on foot, and they struck for about 3 weeks until it fizzled out. Now, it seems kind of surprising to some people that cowboys would go on strike because, you know, with Western fiction and what you see in the Western movies, cowboys love nothing better than riding around on the back of a horse all the live long day for $1 a day, because, you know, they get to sing and shoot people, you know, that sort of thing. Both things that cowboys did far less than we think. They did a lot of singing, mainly to soothe the cows, but as far as gunplay, it was very rare out on these ranches and certainly rare in the western towns. So this is an historic structure in that it speaks directly to the cowboy strike, because what happened here at the T Anchors, the cowboys here went on strike as well, and the managers decided after hearing a rumor that a group of armed cowboys were going to come take the T Anchor Ranch by force. Well, they rigged up this building as a giant bomb. They put a barrel in the middle, we think, and they filled it with pieces of broken metal like this horseshoe and packed it in there with dynamite and ran a fuse out the door to a ditch that was fairly far away and they thought would be out of harm's way. And it was the job of a black cook named Gus Lee. His job was to light the fuse and run for cover in the ditch. Now, fortunately, that did not happen. The cowboys never showed up. But it also speaks to the fact that cowboys carrying guns is largely mythology. For the most part, cowboys didn't carry guns because they just got in the way for ranch work. Likewise, certainly by the mid-1880s, most ranches out here in the Panhandle had rules posted on the walls of the bunkhouses and the chow halls forbidding cowboys from carrying firearms simply because they were dangerous and they could be harmful to the stock. Because believe me, the cows and the horses were far more valuable to the ranch than the cowhands were themselves. And so carrying firearms is largely mythology. Now, we do know from out here, most cowboys, if they owned a gun, it was frequently Army surplus, and therefore it was of an older model and might be somewhat dangerous. But if they did own them, they were obliged to keep them in the chuck wagon or at ranch headquarters. And then when they went on a trail drive that got close to Oklahoma, of course, everybody was healed when you get close to Oklahoma, because it's always best to be armed when you go into Oklahoma. Everybody knows that. So that's one of the myths that's promoted by the movies, is that cowboys were always covered with guns, and that's just not really true. Many of them did carry saddle guns, usually in a scabbard under their saddle, usually for varmints, and we know, of course, that Gene and Roy could shoot the eye out of a rattlesnake from 6,000 yards. But most cowboys, if they carried a long arm on their saddle, it was usually a carbine or a shotgun, because it worked a lot better from close range. And so this building is extremely important, but it tells lots of different stories. And you can see as you look around the room, all kinds of things in here, even animal bones, buffalo skulls, and so on. Cowboys were very, very interested in history generally, and even after the turn of the century, when most people think cowboys disappeared, they had a great belief in that they were part of the legacy of the Old West, and wanted to keep that alive through symbolic things like buffalo skulls and the old way of doing things and so on. And so cowboy tradition is certainly alive and well still out in the western parts of the country, where it was celebrated and honored as it should have, a vital part of American history. We're glad you came to tour the T Anchor Ranch buildings. Obviously, they're important historically, but also important to what they symbolize about traditions that are slowly fading away if we don't preserve them. And that's what museums like Panhandle-Plains Historical Museum, we're all about. Our mission is to remember the stories that go along with these artifacts that we have preserved inside the buildings. And really an artifact or a building with a bunch of old stuff in it is just an antique store. A museum collects stories to go along with those artifacts, and the stories are all over the place associated with the T Anchor. At one time they even held an annual rodeo for the old T Anchor ranch hands, and that kind of frittered away as most of them passed on. But it's our job to give voice to those cowboys and those cowmen, and also the women that came out here and worked. For example, the wife of one of the first managers, Mrs. Truby, came out here and took care of the boys, and most of the time when the women came out here as ranch managers, they became a surrogate girlfriend, a surrogate mama. Those women acted as nurses to these young men, and many times they sort of acted as a surrogate sweetheart as well. And so it's important to remember that these were young men who were very much a part of American history, and especially of Western history. And we're glad you can come out to Panhandle-Plains and see it through the film we've produced for you today, and also the fact you can come here in person and walk through these rooms yourself and experience the feel and the sounds and the smells of what a ranch was like back out here in the 1870s and 1880s.